Sit down, that's all right. I don't have a ton to say because I really want to get into this deep dive, but I've given a lot of thought about flows because that's what stream management plans were supposed to be, like Nicole just said. To me, everything else was work that we'd already been doing and that we're still doing. All the assessments, the hydrological, geomorphological, biological, been funding that through watershed planning for a long time, whether it be a CWCB initiative or it was a non-point source EPA 9 elements plan that was being leveraged with CWCB dollars. So stream management planning was building on top of that. And then what are your objectives for environment and recreation in your basin or in your reach or whatever you're looking at, and then identifying those. And I think I came into it thinking too simply about it because, you know, I started my career doing agriculture, being on ditch boards, and so I was looking at it like, well, if I'm going to flood irrigate X number of acres of corn, I know how much water I need. So that's what we should be thinking about. If I want a self-sustaining fishery, what are the flows I need for that? Or if we are stocking trout on the South Platte below Chatfield, what are the flows that we need for that? Well, it wasn't that easy. I think a lot of us found that out, and there's, I think, different ways to go about it depending on where your basin is and what your stakeholders are thinking. But I will say that the assessment piece is science, and it shouldn't be traded for anything. I don't think there should be any compromise on identifying what those flow needs are. I think the compromise can be in identifying what your objectives are. If you're saying we want healthy riparian areas, then you're looking at different flows than if you're saying we just want water for fish every day. Those are different flows. And so that could be something discussed and figured out amongst the stakeholders. But the science of identifying the flows is just that. And then the more I thought about it, it's never going to be just a flow. It's going to be a range of flows, because short of getting in the river and doing some kind of survey like R2 Cross or something similar to that, you're not going to know exactly what you need, because it's going to be tough to find those representative reaches and then just translate that over such a broad area. So it's a lot of learning by doing, which is the last stream management plan we got involved in. Because now we're paying the salary for learning by doing. So, you know, I'm thinking about different scenarios other than what we talked about. We have to think more farther out with stream management plans, I think. When I lived in Georgia 20 plus years ago, I used to give everybody a little walnut tree as a gift, and it'd be like, this tree, you know, maybe your grandkids will get walnuts off of it. We got to kind of think that way, because the water and the values around water, they may change in basins, they may not, but if the science is there to support that, then you don't have to go back through this planning process again. Maybe you got to dust it off a little bit, but you don't have to redo it. And then I start thinking about demand management, you know, and what's going on downstream. And this is where I could get in trouble with my leadership, because I don't know a ton about it. But I do know that if water is leaving the state of Colorado, it should be leaving in a way where we're getting the most benefit for environment and recreation as it leaves. And that's where stream management plans could be incredibly helpful too. And maybe a little less polarizing, or maybe even more, depending on where we are and how we're talking about it. I also think we get wrapped around the axle a little bit with the hydrology piece. I'd like to see that expanded more and a little more traditional engineering going into our plans with hydrological and hydraulic modeling. And I think 2D modeling is a good idea for most every watershed these days, especially those at risk of burning, because then we can use that information for our pre-fire mitigation planning and dovetail it right into stream management planning, and kind of get a picture of what the high flows are doing. But we can also get an idea of what the overbank flows are, So if then our objective becomes riparian health, well, we've already kind of figured that out through our modeling on what those flows are. So maybe we don't have to come in and say, well, our objective is riparian health and we're going to figure out the water that we need for it. Maybe we say we're going to do a full hydrological modeling in here and do 2D hydraulic modeling, and you'll just know what those flows are. So if then people come in and say, yeah, let's focus on riparian health in here, then you'll already have a nice model built for that. It's the really low flows, and this is where I'm looking forward to hearing from Mickey and Seth on this, is the biggest challenge, identifying those dry up points, and identifying what we need just to support aquatic life to the bare minimum. Those are flows that I think stream management plans should be identifying. I think that's about all I have.
So that was a great introduction to this conversation today from Chris. I think I think I can bring some perspective to this coming from the other side, the side where I'm a consultant trying to work with stakeholder groups to develop these plans, and I have kind of a different take on why it is that we maybe don't get to the point where we're defining flows. And it has, I think, a lot to do with the diversity of the stakeholder groups that we're trying to keep engaged in a process and keep happy or maybe non-adversarial. And the couple projects that I've been in where the intent was stated right out front to develop environmental flow targets, right away that was a problem for 50% of the people in the room. And we spent a lot of time trying to rebuild that goodwill and get back to the point where we could have a conversation about the other stuff. And so I think that is a particularly vexing problem, particularly in over-appropriated systems where there isn't water to be had, and where there is no reservoir with some water that you might think about buying, leasing. The Crystal is a good example. It's over-appropriated. You're never really meeting environmental targets, and everybody in the room knows who you're going to be talking to if you want to realize some extra water in the river. And so that really does kind of set the mood in a very distinct way and colors the way the conversations go, and I think is going to be something that's challenging so long as we're trying to keep these voluntary kind of ad hoc groups engaged in this kind of planning. Nonetheless, I'm here to talk about things that you might do to characterize or quantify flow needs in the context of these plans. I'm going to break the conversation apart in a couple different ways. Very generally, we're going to be talking about different assessment tools for characterizing environmental and recreational use needs. And then we're going to talk about the different ways that you might take results from those characterizations and then use them to set targets or management objectives. Go ahead. Specifically, start with a brief conversation about setting context for your plan and the way in which you set the context, how setting the context does kind of dictate the types of methods that you might then use to generate information that you plan around. We'll talk a little bit about specific assessment methodologies, including things like R2 cross, 2D modeling, like Chris mentioned, and some others. Briefly touch on some of the kind of limitations and uncertainties that come along with any kind of assessment work that you might do, and then round it out with a discussion about how you might use that information to then kind of move toward the conclusion of your plan where you're generating recommendations for achieving flows for riparian areas or fish or boating. Okay, so we'll start with that brief discussion of context setting. So one of the things that's become really apparent to me is the role that geographic area plays in really constraining the types of work that you then might do over the rest of the project. We've done planning work on reaches as short as 7 miles and as broad as 75 miles. And when you're doing a 75 mile, when you're doing an assessment over 75 miles of river, and that 75 miles includes different river characteristics, different morphologies, different biotic communities in the channel and out of the channel, it becomes quite a challenge then to think about, well, how am I going to actually do an assessment that fairly characterizes the diversity of these geographies and environmental settings or recreational settings, and provide kind of useful information given the budget and the time constraints that we have associated with our plan. So really thinking hard up front, if you are coordinating or planning one of these efforts, about how your particular geography might then dictate the level of detail that you might expect to get out of any kind of assessment work. It's important, I think, in that initial work to kind of map out and use maybe the non-consumptive needs assessment mapping that came out of the 2010 SWASI as a baseline, but think about the environmental attributes that exist in your area of interest, think about the recreational attributes that people might be concerned about, and again, use that to inform your kind of preliminary thinking about how it is that someone might go about doing an assessment that reflects those attributes. I think it's important at the front end. We kind of often expect that we're going to do an assessment and then we'll know what we're going to do based on the assessment. But I think it's really important to have some sense of where you're trying to get. What's the story that you're trying to piece together? We're going to do an assessment to tell us X about this attribute, and that's going to help us do this. If you can kind of fill in those gaps, then I think you'll have a much easier time at your planning than if you expect that hiring somebody to do an assessment on a reach is going to then tell you exactly what it is you should have done on your stream of interest. I think that's a tough way. It works in some settings, but I think it's non-optimal. And doing all those things then I think helps generate an assessment that really kind of meets expectations and can be really useful in producing the kinds of recommendations that you expect to come out of it. So, for example, if your expectation at the front end, if your stated clear expectation at the front end is, Chris Sturm told me that this plan is primarily about setting flow targets, and we want to identify flow targets for fisheries and boating, and you state that up front, then your assessment's probably going to give you the information that you need to do that work. If, on the other hand, you say, we want to do an assessment, we need to hire somebody to do an integrated assessment, you might get information that doesn't necessarily directly support the thing that you thought you were getting or wanted. So be real clear. Okay, so that's the prep bit. There are a great diversity of methodologies that you might then use if your stated objective is to identify flow targets for environment or rec. I'm going to touch on a very limited number of them, but I tried to grab a diverse set that gives you some kind of sense of what's out there. But this is not an exhaustive list by any means. So we've got assessment approaches that are based primarily on hydrological characterizations and some mapping of risk based on a difference between a natural hydrological regime and the existing or managed hydrological regime. The indicators of hydrological alteration is one method that you might see or use to do this. It's very simply a comparison of hydrographs from those two cases, natural and managed, development of some statistics that tell you something about the shape of the hydrograph, basically, and then comparing differences between those statistics and identifying some departure from normal. And I can tell you how much your peak flows have decreased or how much your base flows have decreased due to water use, for example. Then there are other methods that kind of build on that The watershed flow evaluation tool is one method that builds on this kind of fundamental statistical characterization of hydrological behavior under this natural and managed condition. The watershed flow evaluation tool uses those statistics, the 30-day mean minimum flow, for example, and uses the difference between those two conditions, natural and existing, to tell you something about the potential risk for degradation of your trout community, for example, or an unconfined riparian community. And you can map those results in pretty ways across a watershed. But it is fundamentally a risk-based approach that is utilizing that statistical characterization of hydrological regime behavior.
Seth, can I say one thing?
Yes.
So we are using a lot of these in the Yampa where it's like 300 miles of river, and I think these sorts of approaches are really useful at scale.
That's
like
right.
Big scales.
That's a great point. This stuff is stuff that you can fairly readily generate, these results, or results that you can generate if you have a working state mod model that you can use to simulate the natural flow condition and then simulate the existing flow condition. There might be other tools at your disposal to characterize the natural flow in your reach, but state mods used regularly for that. So you need that information, and then you need some mapping of, where do trout live, where do warm water fish live, where are your riparian communities in a confined setting versus an unconfined setting, and then you can generate this across a very wide geography very relatively quickly. It doesn't cost a lot, but it's also fairly coarse in its characterization of local needs, right? There's no reason to think that this red dot here at this particular point in the map, if you zoomed in all the way down and you found that point on the stream, that's actually the characteristic at that point, right? But it does, gives you a sense of the diversity of conditions relatively across an area. Okay, so as we go, we're going to be looking at more complicated assessment approaches that require kind of more ground truthing or more on-the-ground data collection. So we start at the very high level. The next approach is a threshold setting approach. This is should be familiar to many of you. R2 cross is a threshold setting method where you go out, you measure the cross-sectional geometry of your channel, you do some one-dimensional hydraulic modeling, and you use the results to tell you something about a minimum flow that may be necessary in your reach to allow fish and other species to transit up and down that reach during low flow conditions and maintain the habitat for those species in that location. The tenon method is another one that is used to develop thresholds, minimum flow thresholds, and it's based on some characterization of mean annual flows. There's the wetted perimeter method, which uses similar information to R2 cross, but instead of looking for some kind of collection of hydraulic characteristics across a range of flows, you're actually looking at this kind of inflection point in wetted perimeter as flows come up and using that point as your minimum flow target. Effective discharge calculations can be used to develop thresholds for sediment transport. So these things can be targeted to aquatic life or sediment and other characteristics. But that gives you a good flavor for threshold setting. Let's go to the next one. The other way to think about assessing conditions is through development of response functions. And this is different than threshold setting, where we're coming up with the flow that we want to manage for that, for maintenance of that attribute. Here we're talking about mapping some condition as a function of changing flow. So if you were to do 2D hydraulic habitat modeling on your reach of river, you would generate these response curves. So this is some work we did on the Middle Colorado, where you end up with these habitat suitability indices for various species and life stages. It tells you something about how good habitat is for some species or life stage, depending on the depth, velocity, and some other characteristics of the channel. Then you can use that information to say, well, we could look across flows and see that as we move from 1,000 CFS to 2,000 CFS, we sure see a pretty massive increase in habitat quality for bluehead in this particular reach. And this method does not necessarily tell you what flow you should be managing for. But in your reach, if you see that, well, under natural conditions, our flows were something like 2,000 CFS during, the kind of moderately low flow period, and now we're at 1,000 CFS, that tells you something about the gap, right? The difference between the natural habitat quality or availability versus your current condition, and you might use that then to think about development of a target. Right? Where do you want to be on this curve based on where you think you were previously? Okay. Okay, so we're going to leave aside the aquatic life stuff for a moment and shift here to recreational use opportunities. There's a specific CWCB endorsed methodology for characterizing recreational use needs in Colorado, and that is the Boatable Days assessment methodology developed by American Whitewater. That methodology relies on distribution of community surveys, some characterization of preferences for flows among different recreational user groups, and then mapping those preferences back to your kind of typical expected hydrologic behavior under different year types. It allows you to compare between years or between reaches on a stream and identify conditions in space or in time that may be more or less limiting to recreational use. With the assumption being that hydrology is the primary kind of limiter to use. That you're not thinking about economic factors, access, cloudy days, any of that, right? It's a strict relationship between flows and opportunities for recreational use. Okay. So we use these methods. Like I said, this is not the comprehensive list of methods that you may run across or expect to use in your stream, but the outputs for many of them have some serious limitations that are worth thinking about. And those primarily have to do with the assumptions that go into the methods themselves. I just mentioned in the recreational use case, we can do a boatable days assessment and identify that there are 100 usable days for kayaking on some reach of stream. If you actually go to that reach of stream, you might find that, well, there's a nasty landowner who chases everybody off that section of river, or there's a bridge, a terrifying bridge that nobody wants to go underneath at all but the very lowest flows, right? So those might be the actual constraints. And if you rely solely on that boatable days assessment number, you might miss something important, or it may lead you to an incorrect conclusion about where opportunities for focused work exist. And that leads us to this last point, is that the information that you get out of the assessments ideally is useful, but it's never going to be everything that you need to make good decisions. So we get to the point where we're ideally using this information to make good decisions, and we've got some different ways that we might think about doing that. If you're working at a very broad scale, like in the Yampa, and you're trying to characterize or identify areas for further focused study, or kind of hot spots in your geography that might indicate some specific local need, then you might think about just characterizing a percent deviation from natural conditions and looking at how that plays out across space for different characteristics of the hydrograph. So this is work from the Yampa again. These are our differences in the one-day maximum flow as a percent of maximum, or a percent of natural, where the bluer colors are, they resemble natural conditions. The warmer colors are a further deviation away. So this information can quickly help you focus in on this part of the watershed versus this part. And if what you're primarily interested in as a group are characteristics, maintaining sediment transport, overbanking flows, riparian function and condition, then use of this metric and thinking about these results in this way might help you zoom in on the Bear River and the Upper Yampa as the place where you want to think about identifying opportunities for further work and developing recommendations. Okay, this one is going to probably be a little bit more familiar to many folks in this room and many of the folks that you might be inviting to your stakeholder group, ag folks in particular. You can, in locations where you have developed thresholds, environmental thresholds, for example, an easy one to think about are the in-stream flow rates. They exist in a lot of places. They are a number or a set of numbers across a year. And if you map a hydrograph against, or map those numbers, the demand for water characterized by that threshold, maybe the in-stream flow rate, across your hydrograph for your reach under a specific year type, then you can compute the gap between the existing flows and the demand for the environmental flow as a duration, so the period of the year where you're not meeting the in-stream flow. And then you can also calculate something like a volume to tell you how much water you're short if you were going to try to fill the gap entirely. This is a map of that kind of calculation on another part of the Yampa downstream of Craig. But this approach can be useful because, again, it speaks to needs in ways that are very familiar to ag users who are thinking about water and volumes, durations, deficits, shortages, things like that. And can also be super useful in places where you've got an upstream reservoir, where you might be thinking about leasing water to augment an in-stream flow, or you might be thinking about working with local water users to contribute water to the river during some part of the year, and can help you think about how much water you might actually be talking about, how long are you thinking, how long do you need water, how much time do you need water in a given year, etc. And then importantly, we have now, as a product of the Colorado Water Plan and the technical update to that plan, we have some thinking about scenarios, future scenarios, climate change, population growth scenarios that may become realities in the state of Colorado. And so another way of thinking about developing kind of targets and recommendations is to map your particular use need, your attribute of interest across the different scenarios that the state has published as part of the technical update. So that's what you're looking at here. We've got in the on the horizontal axis these different scenarios, A through E. We've obviously got different facets or panels for months of the year. This top one is telling you something about the number of days in a given month, in a given scenario, that you're meeting the in-stream flow rate. You're meeting 3 out of 3 R2 cross criteria versus 2 out of 3 in the yellow or 1 out of 3 in the orange. So it tells you something about what period of the year you have shortages against the in-stream flow rate, and then how things are expected to change as you think about the different scenarios the state is holding up as possibilities for the future. Same thing here. This is a characterization of boatable days. So the number of days that fall into kind of an optimal flow in green, suboptimal in orange, and not at all acceptable in red for recreational users on this reach of the San Juan, and then fishing use down here in the bottom. So you can think about characterizing your data in this way, and that might help you think about, well, if we're in a no regrets kind of planning environment, and we really think that the losses of these boatable days in June are going to be a real problem for our community that really relies on tourism and recreation dollars to support our economy. Let's figure out how, if we think hot and dry is coming, how can we augment flows in June to support boating use, or how can we do some work in the channel to make boating at lower flows a possibility? And that's in fact what they're talking about in the San Juan now. Okay, go Another way to think about it is in terms of specific projects, proposed projects or potential projects. This is characterization of an infrastructure project on the upper reaches of the Rio Grande, where there is one of these bridge hazards that's limiting recreational use as much or more than flows themselves. And so you could think about identifying the kind of gap in recreational use as a function of the difference between the existing bridge and the potential future bridge that is 10 feet higher or something, right? So you might think about characterizing your needs or your gaps in that way instead. Okay. And finally, it's really important to put all of your results in context with other expected changes in your watershed or in your area of interest. Those changes might be a function of kind of growing, developing communities, right? If you're really focused on riparian area health and you've identified some important, you've identified an area that is in great shape and doesn't need any work, right?
Well, first off, thanks for the invitation to join this group today. You know, we've popped our heads into stream management planning processes around the state here and there, and I'm really glad to hear that this group is considering how to bring flow targets back to the forefront of these plans, because it's something that the Water Trust has thought a lot about over the years, and we expected a lot more to come out of those initial plans. And so if we can help be a part of encouraging that moving forward, we're happy to do so. So for those of you that I haven't met, you can go to the next slide. And I apologize for everyone that's seen this slide 25 times. Colorado Water Trust is a statewide nonprofit organization that was started back in 2001 with the specific goal of supporting the CWCB's in-stream flow program to get more water in rivers around the state. We exclusively focus on voluntary transactions to benefit the natural environment. And these deals are really, really flexible. So we'll get into a little bit of what those can look like later on in this presentation. But we're really focused on working within that prior appropriation system and generating the ability to compensate water users at fair market value to use water for environmental uses. You can go to the next slide, please. And so to date, you can see the distribution of our projects across the state. Many of these were in partnership with the CWCB. Most of them are on the west slope. You may notice, I would argue that it's a lot easier to do flow transaction work on rivers that are not grossly over appropriated. As many of you know, the cultural and social piece of this work is really, really challenging, and that's part of the reason I think we're here today to talk about how you incorporate these things into the plans and move projects forward that can actually generate some benefits. So talking about flow targets and restoration tools, I want to make a distinction here. You know, if Seth goes through an assessment for a stream management plan, a river health assessment, and finds, you know, that flows are looking really good in certain areas or certain reaches year round, you know, you may be looking more at flow protection tools versus flow restoration tools. And this is a distinction that I wish we didn't have to talk about as much, but I weave this into every single presentation I give around the state when talking about flow restoration, because there's a big difference between flow protection tools in Colorado and flow restoration tools. So there are many more options for protecting flows than just those two, but I think for the purposes of this group's consideration, new in-stream flow appropriations and recreational in-channel diversions are the two water rights mechanisms that will protect flows as they exist at the time of appropriation. Where the Water Trust is really focused in our work with CWCB and outside of the in-stream flow program is more on the flow restoration side. So you've got flow targets identified potentially, or you've got a water short reach. There's a number of tools in the state of Colorado. We're very fortunate to have legal tools that span kind of the whole gamut of what might be possible. And so I think something to keep in the back of your minds as you work on stream management plans and you start to develop project ideas, even if you're just trying to inform discussions with water users on the front end, and thinking about what may be possible 5 or 10 or 30 years down the line. We have these tools today. They're really flexible. If there's an interested water user, water rights owner, we can most likely develop a program or project that will meet their needs while meeting the co-benefits of in-stream flows or in-stream flow targets. So real quick, I just want to mention we have these formal transfer tools that actually allow for transfer of water rights to the in-stream flow program that would be held by CWCB. There's also opportunities like targeted and coordinated reservoir releases, which I'll run through a quick example of what happened on the Yampa River this year because I think it's instructive. I didn't know Seth was going to talk about the Yampa, but that was perfect. Even on a system that is just verging on over-appropriation, it takes a village to support defined streamflow targets that we've had for a long time in that basin. So none of this is coming out of the IWMP that Nicole's working on yet, but I think a lot of the same projects will help support new flow targets that could be identified through the work she's doing. Something I always encourage people to think about is how you can do streamflow restoration projects without necessarily focusing on in-channel water rights. So can you make deliveries of pre-existing decreed water downstream through a reach that needs additional flows during certain times of year for already decreed uses? That can be downstream hydropower generation. It could be an ag-to-ag lease, so a lease of irrigation water rights downstream to another irrigation user. Really look for those opportunities to manage the system as an integrated system of storage and supply for all of your different uses. And then we've got some really flexible non-in-stream flow transaction tools, low barrier to entry. I won't use the term I typically refer to the water conservation programs as, but they really allow people to get in the door, get their feet wet with what it could look like to manage their water rights differently. It allows for water rights protections, it can open the door for compensation, and you can do some targeted stream flow restoration using that tool in the right circumstance. So when we talk about protection versus restoration, I can't go any farther without talking about the in-stream flow program at CWCB, some of Chris's colleagues. I'll just cut right to the chase on this. The big difference that I want to mention here is the in-stream flow program has two authorities. They can appropriate new junior in-stream flow water rights, so protect a certain flow rate between 2 points in the river. That's typically done based on recommendations developed by either Colorado Parks and Wildlife or the Bureau of Land Management using the R2 cross methodology that Seth mentioned. But these new appropriations can also be recommended by any other entity that wants to do the science to support that flow recommendation. So if you're looking at a basin-wide integrated water management plan, and one of the things you stumble across is that you have a great stream for potential native cutthroat reintroduction, maybe your best tool there is to recommend a new in-stream flow appropriation, or recommend that someone else recommends that new in-stream flow appropriation to the CWCB. The other arm of the CWCB's in-stream flow program is their acquisition arm. And you can go to the next slide and I'll get into a little bit of the difference between these two. But the acquisition arm really allows them to acquire senior water rights. So when you talk about new junior appropriations, the in-stream flow program didn't exist until 1973. So in many cases, they were 100 years late to the appropriation party. There may not have been any water available to appropriate, and that is indeed the case in many stream systems across the state. So they're limited to the water available. None of those new appropriated water rights are going to be protectable past senior diversion, so that would be the end of the in-stream flow reach if indeed there were water available to appropriate in that system. And it's limited to that minimum amount required to preserve the natural environment to a reasonable degree. And so Seth showed those habitat suitability curves, and you're really right at the beginning of the important habitat to preserve those species. And that's where acquisitions can come into the fold. And acquisitions actually allow the CWCB to acquire senior water rights. It could be any type of water right. They maintain that senior priority, so we can get around that issue of having junior 1973 and younger water rights. This allows the CWCB and partners to actually restore flows to depleted stream systems. And you can actually define a flow rate above that minimum required to preserve the natural environment. So you can look at more of what an optimum flow may be for whatever your target species may be in those reaches. Again, super flexible transaction tools in Colorado. These can work for any type of water user, municipal, irrigation, industrial, etc. Can be short-term, one-year deals, can be 10-year long-term lease deals, can be perpetual leases with provisions for the original owner to pull back water if they need it for certain uses. But I think the important thing to remember is that we can take the constraints of any water user when we're thinking about planning for the future of a stream system or a reach of river. We can take those constraints today and look at the options of how we can fit into their needs and get some more water in the river during certain times of year. And so both Seth and Chris and some others in the room, I'm sure, are familiar with some of the work that the Water Trust has done. But where I've been headed with this lately, and where I think we need to head as a community, is really look in a targeted fashion at what those needs are. Sure, there are stream systems that need a ton more water year-round to even get by. There's no question about that. But there's a lot of stream systems around the state that really just need a bump during either runoff or need a small bump during base flow period where there may be some dry up for 2 weeks or a month. And those are things we can address with small changes to existing water uses, and we can do that with transaction tools we have today. So I'd love to see more thought into recommendations of projects that could get at some of those issues. So you all are very familiar with the stakeholder process. Engagement early and often with all water users, I think, is really important to defining what projects could look like to restore stream flows or protect stream flows. I saw a great presentation last Friday at the River District's annual seminar where Dr. Jack Schmidt spoke about the environmental community not really knowing what it is we want. And he was talking about the Grand Canyon specifically and management of releases from Powell and kind of the changing desires to manage that system over time. And so there's no clarity on what the environmental community actually wants and what that environment should look like in the Grand Canyon. And I thought that was pretty interesting thinking about giving this presentation today, because I think we look at stream systems and in many cases, we can look at that system and say like, wow, we need more late summer base flow in this stream. It looks terrible. It's obviously not a good situation when we see temperatures spiking and fishing closures that are slapped down across the state. But what's the real need there? I think the City of Steamboat Stream Management Plan and some of the work that went into that was a good thing to think about, because for a long time we had everyone pointing towards flow as the limiting factor in the Yampa's temperature issues, and then some work was completed to say, well, certainly flow is a part of it, but the bigger issue is riparian shading. And so we can look at the flow component, but we really need to focus on additional shade projects. And I just think that's an important thing to think about, is really from the environmental perspective and the recreational perspective, I should say, as well. What are our needs? What do we want to bring to the table? And bring that to a discussion with all of those water users as soon as you can. It doesn't need to be a defined plan, but they know what these stream management plans are going to be. I think it's important that we say, in the end, we're looking to identify what that limiting factor is for this system and address that potentially through collaborative projects. And how do you get there with all these users? You understand their constraints on the front end, because I think we have a real opportunity through these stream management plans to optimize the management of these systems, whether it's using direct flow water rights or stored water. But if you don't understand all the constraints, we'll never be able to put together a program that could address several things at once. I would encourage, I think probably all of you are engaged, but as we're not a stakeholder in these stream management plans, I did want to just mention early engagement with CPW and agency biologists and staff is really important to understand what some of those limiting factors may be way before you get to the river health assessment phase. A lot of our partners in the water user community care about all the same things we care about, and if we can put a fine point on that discussion early on, without saying we're going to come in here and fix this river from a flow perspective, without being able to say what that might look like, I think that's been some of the struggle with alienation of water users to date. So just kind of being transparent, but also understanding what it is we want from our perspective. So I'm going to just jam through this really quickly because I know we're a little over time here, but I just wanted to present one example. And this is the Yampa River, Northwest Colorado. Many of you are from there. I imagine everyone's somewhat familiar. But this is just 2021, what went into supporting flows on the Yampa that I am aware of. It may not be a great example for some other basins because it's largely focused on storage, but I actually think that's a good example, as this is the lowest barrier to entry we could probably have at getting water back into a stream system. So circling back to the flow protection versus restoration conversation on the Yampa, we have two things that protect flows today, and that's an in-stream flow reach and a recreational in-channel diversion. So both of those are in the city of Steamboat Springs or upstream. The in-stream flow reach on the Yampa actually starts just downstream. This is Stagecoach Reservoir. It may be kind of hard to see, but it just starts about half a mile downstream from Stagecoach Reservoir and continues on down to Lake Catamount. Carries a 2001 priority. So this is not pulling water past upstream diverters. It's not pulling water past Stagecoach Reservoir. It's just there to kind of preserve the minimum amount available in most years to support this cold water fishery in this reach. The other protection mechanism on the Yampa is in the city of Steamboat Springs. These are the flow rates here from their RISD decree. You can see ramping up with runoff into June and peaking in June and then coming down, tapering off into August. This carries a 2003 priority. So again, in the Yampa Basin, extremely junior water right, but it also creates a mechanism, which we'll get to in a minute, that allows for restoration. So we have these two protection mechanisms way up high in the Yampa Basin. I would argue they haven't done a great job of protecting flows down lower in the basin. There were discussions about an in-stream flow appropriation in the lower Yampa, is my understanding, but that was politically infeasible back in the 90s when it was proposed. I don't know if that has changed today. Maybe Nicole does. But looking to flow restoration opportunities in the Yampa Basin, and just based on what we did this year, so this isn't even the suite of options, this is just what happened in 2021. We made deliveries to the in-stream flow reach, not officially, but this is an incidental benefit of other deliveries. We had the ability to deliver water to the recreational in-channel diversion. We delivered water to temperature demand in the city of Steamboat. And then there were a bunch of releases to the endangered fish recovery programs, critical habitat reach in the lower river. So we can run through these really quickly. So the in-stream flow loan, again, not used officially this year, but should be some opportunity here in the future with a new statutory tool that allows for in-stream flow use without a water court change in 5 out of 10 years. We expect to submit an application for that this fall, but I wanted to mention this as it's a really important mechanism to get water out of storage and into the Yampa River. You can go to the next slide. Releases to the city of Steamboat Springs. Our agreement with the city allows us to deliver water either to the RISD when it's short, or we can make deliveries to the city's wastewater treatment plant when they're exceeding their temperature standard. We've done this since 2015 in the city, and not only has the Water Trust made releases, but the city of Steamboat has released their own water for this use to support the river as well. Something that was a little different this year is we also had the ability to make releases down to Tri-State's Craig Station. So this is actually just a delivery of water. Now you may be catching on with Stagecoach. We're just using the existing decreed uses in that bucket to send water to downstream points that may show demand in a year as bad as 2021. So the city had it almost all summer. We made those deliveries. Tri-State's Craig Station, we're only allowed to make deliveries when the Yampa River is on call and their direct flow water rights are out of priority, so we never actually made these deliveries. But it was another mechanism we had kind of layered on to be able to release and protect this water downstream. Any deliveries under that tool were going to be limited to our targets based on our agreement with the city of Steamboat Springs, but would have pulled that water down farther through the system, and actually had another layer that would have allowed Tri-State to further support the recovery program, which I'll mention in a minute. So we're just at 3 mechanisms already, 1 reservoir, moving on to the 2nd reservoir, and mechanism number 4 is the endangered fish recovery program's releases to their critical habitat reach. They have access to up to 7,000 acre-feet of water in Elkhead Reservoir each year to meet these programmatic biological opinion flow targets in the lower river. This water is delivered all the way down through the system. Flow targets are altered based on the hydrologic year type. And these aren't just focused on base flows. They can also use their existing water rights to do something like a spike flow or whatever other management practice may be needed to meet their goals for the year. So if base flows aren't a concern, they can work to disadvantage non-native species that present a predation issue for the native endangered fish. So number 5 is we had the River District and Tri-State Generation and Transmission, 2 private entities stepping up with their own water rights to release those to an existing decreed use, which we won't get into the legal nuances of today, but they really looked outside the box to get more water in the river to support the recovery program's flow targets, and then that was released to other uses to not only support endangered fish, but also support all other uses. The goal of these releases was to help keep the call off the Yampa River, so really supporting junior water users in the basin in addition to the recovery program's reach. And so I'll stop there so we can get into the important part of today's discussion, but I think the important takeaway is that if you stay engaged early with stakeholders and you understand what could be possible from a protection and restoration perspective, I think that can give us a better foundation to build some collaborative projects on. I know, I personally would love to see more of these move forward that can support multiple uses, whether it's in-stream flow use or recreational and channel diversion or other non-consumptive use, and then be picked up again downstream in a reach where they may not be needed for a consumptive use. So we can all win if we set this up right and we understand the constraints.
Hey Vicki, just one question. How much money did all of that cost this year?
Good question.
I think it's an important point for this group to understand. This doesn't just happen.
Yeah. So let me think off the top of my head, just the Yampa releases out of Stagecoach. The Water Trust spent over $80,000 just on water. The City of Steamboat released another, I shouldn't guess at the number, but they've got a perpetual contract, so they're holding on to that water regardless. It's hard to put a number on that, but I would say that was another maybe $15,000 to $20,000 worth of water. Upper Yampa Water Conservancy District also released water voluntarily, 1,500 acre-feet of water, which I didn't mention because it wasn't actually protected anywhere. But that has a lost value to Upper Yampa. And then the Elkhead releases, the River District spent $50,000, and Tri-State, I don't know how much they ended up releasing, but they offered up, I think, 750 acre-feet. So however they wanted to value that, I don't know.
Yeah, so it's somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000.
Yeah, we're well over, just the Water Trust is well over $600,000 invested in just our Stagecoach project since 2012. So the storage releases take money, but these same types of deals can happen with direct flow water users. They can be perpetual agreements or permanent transactions as well. There's nothing preventing, a lower cost as you go down the time horizon.